The lights dimmed just enough to make the edges of the stage blur. Not atmospheric. Practical. This was not a theater. It was a televised town hall billed as America's future in confrontation. And tension was the guest of honor. On one side sat Stephen Miller, known for his hardline rhetoric and policy precision. Opposite him stood Denzel Washington, actor, activist, and moral presence in a room full of optics and optics only. Both men faced each other across a stark table, with cameras angled to catch every expression, every hesitation. The host raised a hand. "Gentlemen, tonight's question, who speaks for America's spirit?" Miller answered first. "I do. Because my policies protect America's identity. They preserve our heritage. They prioritize citizens over chaos." He leaned forward, voice sure. The audience responded with polite applause. Then Denzel spoke, quietly at first. "You speak for an America afraid to dream. You speak for an America that closed its doors long before it looked in the mirror." A hush fell. Miller's eyes narrowed. "That's not an answer." Denzel inhaled. "It's a statement. Because words like heritage and citizen don't just describe America. They limit it." Miller shifted. "You're playing semantics." Denzel's gaze didn't move. Words carry weight. You don't get to hide behind policy when those words define who belongs and who doesn't. The host tried to step in. "Let's keep it." But Denzel raised his hand softly. Not aggressively, but with the calm of someone who'd been knowing injustice his whole life. The room fell silent again. Before this becomes another viral snippet stripped of its full power, before the media edits out the heart to package the flash, I need to say this. What you're about to hear doesn't come from a script. It comes from history, and nobody wants it amplified. So if you believe in hearing real moments, unfiltered, unsanitized, hit subscribe now. Because what Denzel says next isn't just a response. It's a reckoning. The room tensed. Miller straightened, and Denzel looked him in the eye. He said, "You don't speak for America." Stephen Miller didn't flinch. Not outwardly, but something behind his expression tightened. He said, "I speak for the Americans who follow the rules, who pay taxes, who want safety, not slogans." Denzel replied, "You speak for fear, Stephen. You speak for the part of this country that sees justice as a threat and inclusion as a dilution." Miller raised his voice slightly. "I speak for millions who are tired of being called bigots because they care about the border." Denzel leaned forward. "You use the border as a wall for everything you don't want to face. You make fear look like patriotism and exclusion sound like law." The audience was no longer neutral. You could hear the shifting in seats, the sharp inhales, the murmurs barely held back. Stephen Miller's tone sharpened. "You think passion makes you right?" Denzel paused. "No," he said. "I think history does." The host tried to steer it back. "Let's talk about policy." But Denzel interrupted, gently. He said, "Stephen, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched a mother teach her black son how to survive a traffic stop?" Miller blinked. "That's not relevant." Denzel's voice stayed level. "It is. Because you make policies from a perch. And people live those policies with fear in their throats. That's the difference between you and me. You draft laws in ink. I've lived them in blood." That line hit like a thunderclap. The room didn't move. Miller said, "I don't write laws. I enforce order." Denzel nodded slowly. "And who decides what that order protects? Who decides who gets to feel safe and who gets to feel small?" The silence turned heavy. Because the question wasn't rhetorical. It was a mirror, and Stephen Miller had no answer. The host tried to regain balance. "Let's talk immigration." Denzel turned to him, calm but direct. "We are." Stephen Miller seized the moment. "This is exactly the problem. Emotion over policy. Theater over facts." Denzel turned back, not smiling. He said, "No. This is truth over spin." Miller's voice rose. "Truth? You're an actor. You memorize lines. I write policy." Denzel replied, "And that's why your policies fail. Because they have no soul." A quiet gasp came from the front row. Stephen Miller leaned in. This country can't run on feelings. Denzel's voice was steady. It runs on justice. Or it doesn't run at all. The host looked between them. Gentlemen. But the conversation had moved past moderation, past politeness. Miller said, "You think calling me cold makes you right?" Denzel shook his head. "I think you've mistaken power for purpose. And that's what breaks countries, not builds them." Stephen's composure began to crack. "So what's your solution? Open borders? No law? Just vibes?" Denzel leaned forward again. His voice dropped, not in volume, but in gravity. He said, "My solution is dignity. My solution is to stop treating people like problems and start treating them like citizens in waiting." Stephen scoffed. "Citizens in waiting? That's not in the Constitution." Denzel answered, "Neither was your family once. Neither was mine. But here we are." And that line, "Here we are," landed with weight. The audience was still, not out of boredom, out of recognition. Because in that moment, every viewer could see it clearly. This wasn't about Denzel Washington and Stephen Miller anymore. This was about who gets to define America, and who never stopped trying to claim it. The host, trying to pull them back from the brink, said, "Let's remember, we're here to find common ground." Denzel's reply was gentle but firm. "Common ground can't exist on uneven footing." Stephen Miller smirked. "That's a nice line. But you still haven't explained how you'd run the country." Denzel met his gaze. With humility. With the understanding that fear is not a substitute for governance. Miller's voice dropped lower. "Fear is what built walls. And walls keep us safe." Denzel looked at him. "Walls keep people out. Bridges bring people together. This country was built by bridges." The audience applauded. Not wildly, but with the kind of slow, deliberate rhythm that said, "We've heard this before, but never like this." Stephen Miller clenched his jaw. "You want an America without rules?" Denzel nodded. "No. I want an America where the rules apply to everyone, not just those you think deserve them." There was a pause. A long, meaningful pause. Then Denzel asked, "Tell me, Stephen, when was the last time someone like you risked everything just for a shot at belonging?" Miller didn't answer. Denzel said, "You sit behind laws like they're shields. But laws without empathy become cages. And I've seen too many cages built in the name of order." Stephen finally said, "This isn't about feelings. This is about sovereignty." Denzel leaned back. "Sovereignty without humanity is just control." Another pause. The audience felt it shift again. Stephen tried to recover. "You don't understand the burden of keeping this country safe." Denzel responded quietly. "I've worn the uniform on screen and the burden off screen. I've met the mothers who bury their sons because safe meant something different to someone in power." The studio fell into a silence so deep, you could hear the hum of the stage lights. It wasn't a clash anymore. It was a reckoning. Stephen Miller didn't speak. Not right away. His lips pressed together. His hands clasped. It was the first moment he seemed to understand that facts without empathy don't move people. And Denzel's words had moved the room. The host tried to reframe the segment. "Maybe we need to re-ask the original question. Who speaks for America?" Denzel turned slightly toward the camera. "Not for performance, but for clarity." He said, "America doesn't need a single voice. It needs to hear the ones it tried to silence." Miller cut in, voice rising again. "So now I'm the villain?" Denzel shook his head. "No, you're just loud. And loud isn't the same as right." The line landed hard. Stephen leaned forward. "You think you know the working class? You think fame gives you a moral compass?" Denzel's tone didn't change. "No, but listening does. And I've spent a lifetime listening to voices your policies drown out." There was no anger in his voice. Just something colder. Something more final. He said, "You don't speak for them. You speak at them." Stephen Miller's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said, "You actors think you're philosophers." Denzel replied, "And you think cruelty is strategy." The audience murmured. A few gasps. No applause. Just realization. Miller stood slightly in his chair. You don't get to question my patriotism. Denzel remained seated. I'm questioning your blindness. Silence. Then Denzel looked down briefly, collected himself, then back up. He said, "This country's greatness doesn't come from shutting doors. It comes from opening them, again and again, until everyone has a seat at the table." The words echoed, not metaphorically, literally. The room was that quiet. The host cleared his throat, trying once again to mediate. "Gentlemen, we're almost out of time." But it was already too late for balance. The moment had tipped. Stephen Miller tried for one last jab. "So tell me, Denzel, if I don't speak for America, who does?" "Hollywood elites." Denzel answered calmly. "No. The single mother working 2 jobs to send her kids to college. The immigrant father who takes night shifts so his daughter can have a future. The young man who turns away from gangs and toward books. The teacher who stays late for the kids no one else believes in. The nurse who goes home crying but shows up the next day anyway. They speak for America, and they don't need a suit and a camera to do it." That was the moment the audience finally applauded. Not wildly, but firmly, as if acknowledging something that had needed saying for too long. Stephen Miller didn't respond. Not because he couldn't, but because anything he said next would sound small. Denzel stood slowly, not to walk out, but because the segment was done. He looked at Miller one last time. "You may write the memos, Stephen, but America lives in the people who never get to read them. And they're watching." He turned to the host. "Thank you for the conversation." Then he walked off set. There was no dramatic music, no commercial break yet. Just the image of a man choosing clarity over comfort, truth over performance. Stephen Miller remained in his seat, still, silent. And across the country, clips of the exchange began to spread before the cameras had even cooled. Because Denzel Washington didn't just confront Stephen Miller. He reminded America who it has always belonged to, and who refuses to let it be stolen by fear.